Now, it is my great pleasure to welcome to the Hollow Path podcast my friend and one of my great teachers and favorite writers, Lee Morgan. Hello, Lee.
Hi Mark, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. Um, Here in France, we are entering the witching hour of the night, just after midnight. And over there on the other side of the world, it is morning.
It is indeed, yes. I've just been ejected into the world, so I'm ready to roll.
Excellent. I love this
Mm.
sort of, we're living in two different realities right now.
hmm
And so, by way of brief introduction, perhaps for some of the people who are listening or watching, you may need no introduction, but I would like to say Lee Morgan is a writer of both poetic and mythical fiction, a writer of books full of teachings about witchcraft, sorcery, magic, fairy, and someone who wraps these together. Also, a practitioner and somebody who uh, teaches and works magic and spellcraft and sorcery on behalf of others and teaches others about learning these things and doing them in harmony and right relation with the world, both human and non human. I personally first discovered your work probably 7 or 8 years ago, heard you on a podcast, looked up the books, and began with A Deed Without a Name. The wonderful quote used as a title, obviously from Shakespeare's Witches in Macbeth. And it was the first book, I must say, that I ever read that was about witchcraft, in which I personally felt a shock of recognition and said, oh, this is me too. This is also part of who I am. And though I had read books and in theory understood and been interested in them, I had never felt that visceral sense of connection and belonging to something that I had not even suspected, to the deed without a name. Now, the occasion of our interview is that Lee's books, particularly fiction, is in the process of being reissued, revised, and republished. And we particularly want to talk about the fiction and its interaction with all the other work and with the work of a life lived uh, in witchcraft and enchantment. So, Lee, could
Mm.
I could I ask you to begin with? Can you describe what you do? Do you have a formula to say, this is what I do, this is my role?
All of it, or just the writing part, or the because
Well,
it's
when somebody asks you what do you do, it's a weird and
I've run
fraught
away.
question, right? Run away.
uh,
Yeah.
no, no, it is a weird question, but I suppose I would say that I engage artistically with reality, whether that be in ritual or whether it is in writing a book. Like I see all reality as an artistic form of some kind, which is created by the stories that we hold about things. And I often try to unravel the things that I would see as being in people's way if they want me to. Obviously, I don't
Mm,
do it, unless they've actually given me consent. But, oh, well, I suppose by opening my book, they're giving me consent. But yeah, like I try to sort of have a little struggle, I guess, with any story that I think is limiting people, and I try to show them ways through the threads that bind their life into a way that they could have not necessarily a better, less painful life, but maybe a more fulfilling life, which I think are two very different things. Like, I think art is not necessarily less painful than other types of stories. It's just a little bit more dramatic and full-bodied.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And I love the way that you say that in several phases, that there's engaging artistically with life for a start. And then that idea that you put forth there of service, like you're doing this for people to help people untangle their own stories, but that good stories, they don't necessarily mean that they're not painful or that we don't there isn't suffering or that there isn't hardship. I think that this is a fundamental thing that our society tends to misunderstand, which is a good life isn't being happy all the time. A good life
No.
isn't frictionless. That what we want is not just happiness and abundance. What we want is meaning.
Mm, exactly. And I think that a lot of the people I see that I feel are kind of stuck in narratives that are compressing them, they're not, yeah, sometimes they're not experiencing a lot of suffering. Sometimes they're actually experiencing a lot of repetition,
Mm,
and there isn't options coming up to change that. And sometimes the way that you change something can be quite uncomfortable.
yeah, yeah. That in fact, in our search for comfort and in
Mm,
our avoidance of friction or avoidance of trouble, that we're actually limiting our own growth and development. That we can't move
mm.
forward because we're stuck in a kind of holding pattern.
Yeah, I don't necessarily like when I go out to sort of unbind those things for other people. I think that's compulsive in me. I don't think it's something where I've kind of sat there and come up with it due to a compassionate motivation. A lot of the time, it just has to do with I seem to be made to see different ways through paths that other people are not necessarily aware of. And when I meet other people, I'm always sort of biting my tongue, going, "But you could change that story, though, couldn't you?
Yeah.
Like you don't have to live through that story."
And so the idea that stories are things that we encounter, we engage with, and that we actually can take control of or weave together in different ways that we can unpick. Um, that's very that's very kind of empowering, and I think that it, in a way, it kind of describes everything that that you do, and
Yeah,
it's
I think
and
it's the
and that
closest
it's
I can
not
come up with, Mark.
yeah, and that
Yeah.
it's not as you say, it's not a sort of conscious altruism. It's just this is who you are. This is what
Mm.
you are moved to do. This is what you are called to do, and you don't really have any choice.
No, and I've learnt over the years to hold it back if the person doesn't consent to it.
Of course.
But it's not always easy.
Yeah. So I'm going to propose, in really kind of engaging with your body of work, that we take a little tour through it. And in that in that spirit, I have imagined that your work, which you have referred to as the haunted books, makes up a sort of a haunted witch house, which
Mm,
I was just reading some of the descriptions from your website and from your fiction about, and also particularly in Standing and Not Falling, of what the house is like,
mm.
whether it be the literal house or whether it be the house that we imagine, the kind of spirit house. But I imagine approaching up a long and winding path with straggling bushes of blackthorn and hawthorn on either side. And between those hedges, we come to a porch, great dark oak door, and push the door, which opens with a creak into the high dark house that is your work. And perhaps we might imagine the ground floor as your teaching books, I guess one might call them,
Mm.
that sort of a trilogy, A Deed Without a Name, and then Standing and Not Falling, and then Sounds of Infinity. Tell me briefly, what moved you to write these books? Why did you first write A Deed Without a Name?
Well, I had written my fiction books first. Like Wooing the Echo was written long before A Deed Without a Name, and I couldn't find any inroads to publish them. And I started to realize that they were inadvertently instructive, that I hadn't necessarily written Wooing the Echo and other fiction to be instructive, but that they sort of did take you on a journey. And I thought to myself, what if I wrote something which kind of made that journey more explicit for
Mm,
people, first of all? And in a lot of ways, they were a key to being able to write my other book or to be able to publish my other books, really,
mm,
because I felt like it sort of invited you into that house in a way, like by writing those nonfiction books. It
yeah,
sort of gives the shape of the background. I almost imagine when you meet the characters in Wooing the Echo that you're meeting people that practice that kind of witchcraft, as if almost it fell off their desk or something.
yeah. I mean, that's I love that, and that in fact, the fictional characters, the narratives that you said, okay, what if I step back and say, what is the grounding? What is the theoretical grounding of what they're doing?
Mm,
You know,
yeah.
so you knew it already, you did it already, you'd been practicing it for years, and you said, well, let's lay down some kind of guidelines. And for me, the description of what I think we can call traditional witchcraft, um, in A Deed Without a Name, was a shock, because it was the first time, and I know it's you were not the first person to talk about these things, but it was the first time for me that I really came across it. And it seemed to speak to a witchcraft that I recognized, not just from my own experience, but also from the history I knew and the folklore and the
Mm,
literature. Um, it seemed like this was the blood and bones of it. This was the thing.
mm,
In the way that other perhaps traditions that I had come into contact with did not. You subsequently went on to write Standing and Not Falling, and this subtitled A Sorcerer's Primer, in which you really lay out a 13-month, 13 moon course to basically initiating oneself.
mm.
Or, as it says in the book, or if you're further along the path, you could do this as a way of revitalizing your practice and your understanding of your path. Why that? Why the sort of the course? Did you find that people had asked you, okay, A Deed Without a Name, amazing, but what do I actually do?
Um, Not exactly. It more sort of followed the trajectory of my own development in the sense that I think the romance of traditional witchcraft called to me through its aesthetic qualities that come through in A Deed Without a Name. But there's also a whole bunch of stuff in the way for people between actually appreciating that and being able to embody that. And I think that Standing and Not Falling is about trying to remove some of those things that might be standing in people's way between being able to let that come through their life. But I also did intend it for people from other occult disciplines as well. So I think that one is my most sort of kindly book.
Kindly is an interesting way to
Kindly.
describe it. I mean, I would agree with you, but I must also point out that some of the moments in it, um, if I would refer to that sort of laying down the bundle and crossing the hedge sort of moment, those are quite intense. Like, that's not a kind experience. That is a
No.
real sort of almost King Lear upon the moor, the bare forked animal is man no
Mm,
more than this, stripping away these lendings and standing unprotected in the face of the wild.
I think if it's done properly, yes. Like I've seen some people not do it properly that have given away a bunch of very superficial things that I could tell at the time were not going to give them that response. But I think if someone actually takes that one on down to the bones, as you say, it is an uncomfortable
Yeah,
sort of just definitely. But the once, like I said at the beginning, I think the results of that discomfort open up a space for people that they can fill with some other story.
definitely. And I think that for me personally, I did that process. I didn't do it 13 months straight through. I kind of did and redid and went forward and backward at a time in my life. I mean, that book became my sort of breviary. I went through it so many times and I did perhaps not everything exactly as it's specified, but did it. Um, and it changed my life. But the thing I think that when you say it's also a kind book, and I love this about it because I find it not that common to these kind of courses, let's say, um, these kind of initiatory processes, is the insistence on right relation, the insistence on community, the insistence
Mm,
on community with one's land and with the
mm.
denizens of one's land, both plant and animal and human, and with creating community and creating bonds. And that is so important. And I think it's often not addressed in these sort of, you know, step by step exercises, which are very self centered, very ego centered.
Yes, I would agree. And I don't think people can be healthy like that. I think the ego just takes up too much space in a person's imagination. They can't actually really create or excel beyond a certain point if they're stuffed full of ego. You sort of have to pull some of that out like a teddy bear to put something else up inside it, you know. I it sounds kind of fun when you make it sound like a teddy bear, but it's probably not that fun
Well,
to
actually,
lose
the
hearing.
idea of a teddy bear being eviscerated and having its stuffing pulled out,
True.
that's actually pretty grim. That's actually pretty
Yeah.
grim, you know?
Okay.
And
So,
what you put inside it, like a homunculus that you've grown from a mandrake, like, yeah, I can see it being pretty dark. Um,
mm,
but yes, the teddy bear, the teddy bear metaphor. Um, and then you sew yourself back up, but with the knowledge that you'll probably have to rip out your stuffing again and again
mm,
and again.
mm.
Um, it's not your Auntie Jones Build a Bear.
No.
Um, but and that was really important to me too. That idea that there's all this work on the self, but then there's all this work on relationship.
Mm.
Right relation with the other beings around us, with the world, um, and a socially conscious message which you delivered in it that was very unabashedly, you have to be you have to try to be a good person. It's not shameful to say it, that power over and power in the self are not the goal. It's community, relationship, that network, that mycelial thing.
I think certainly when it comes to your community, you have to be in right relation. I mean, there may be times when you have to oppose something for true health, but I think that in general, like we have to have good relationships with those that we share our life with. I would
Mm.
definitely say that.
Now, the third of those, and this will provide the transition into the stories, is
Mm,
Sounds of Infinity. And Sounds of Infinity was again a revelation for me. The book on fairy and the book on the place of fairy and the good hidden folk in magic and sorcery of the kind that we are talking about. But what's amazing in this book is that you provide a three-part structure, which you referred to as head and heart and hands.
mm,
And I can see this being sort of, this is where in the ground floor of our witch house, we're going into the kitchen and scullery. It's not just about going from the study where we do the theoretical bit and the historical bit and the anthropological, literary sort of history of the fairy faith and the fairy way of being. But then in the heart section, which you entitled A Poetic Exploration of Fairy, there's a bridge because this is a story. This is a piece of fiction. And finally, you provide a grimoire section, the hands, where we get our hands dirty and do the practical work. So it's a really amazing structure and idea. And I won't go into the subject of fairy because I know you did a really fantastic interview with Douglas Batchelor, wasn't it, on What Magic Is This?
Yes.
In the series A Fistful of Fairies, which was excellent, and your particular interview in that was really good. So your sort of take and your insight on the kind of the fairy culture and the fairy lore, there's a really good example of that out there. But what I want to go for more is that story that is at the heart of that book. It is called The Heart. And that leads into all of your other fiction. And there is this mysterious feeling of, oh, I have just tugged a strand of a web that is infinitely complex. What was the thinking behind putting a piece of storytelling in the middle of that book?
I suppose by that point, I felt like I could. I felt like my books had become popular enough that someone might indulge coming into my story world. And so I made a little quiet invitation in that book to people to see how it feels to be inside one of my stories. And I hoped that down the track it might lead people to recognize that my books are sort of all interconnected by little threads. And yeah, I didn't get an immediate reaction to it, but then I hadn't been able to publish all of the fiction that I have today. So I think now people are starting to make the connections between them, and I'm getting the occasional email to that effect of people saying, "Oh my God, this person is connected to this person." And
And so
yeah,
tell us just in 2 words, whose story is being told in that little piece. And I want to conceive of that as being a hidden backstairs that leads us up to the next level of the witch house. What is the story?
mm, oh, yeah, that's a tough question.
Okay. Well, let's not go there. Let's just say um, it's a story that is, what is the setting of that story? Just to give people an idea.
Well, it's set in the Middle Ages, and it's at the time of, well, it's at the time when Robin Goodfellow, who appears later in the Gusty Deep, is meant to be a child. So it's around shortly after the arrival of the Green Children of Woolpit, who
Mm.
emerged in the pits that they used to use to kill the wolves with when they were, very anti-wolf in those days. Um, and yeah, it's in the 12th century, and it's I suppose I think it's early enough in history that it catches some of that mythic quality, but it's
Yeah,
not too far back in history.
yeah. So the Green Children of Woolpit, I'm sure probably people have heard the story, but these children who showed up, as you say, in the wolf pit, but told apparently told a story about a life in kind of in the other world, and spoke a language no one understood. And they're in that vein of stories of children raised by wolves and children of the forest and children who have showed up throughout history seeming to have come to, you know, through their childhoods, raised by something other,
Mm.
coming
And
from
they
something
never
other.
say that they're fairy, but they say they come from St. Martin's land where there's neither sun nor moon.
Right.
And they herd cattle, and one day they hear a strange noise and head towards it and end up in the world of humans.
Yeah. And so, and what's amazing about that, this glimpse we get of that story is that you're telling us a story that is set in the time of medieval romance and stories of courtly love and knights and quests, but also, of course, the folkloric stories of Robin Hood, etc., which is it's sort of in that um, which it's connected to. But the story, the way you tell it, it has a visceral, um, gritty realness, and you're talking about um, the people at that time who diced with the other, who diced with the other world, who diced with sorcery and all of that. And reading it, one is entirely convinced that this is yes, this must have been how it feels and how it smells and how it looks. Now, as you said, those characters, it perhaps acts as a pendant or a prologue to the Gusty Deep, which comes later. And the Gusty Deep takes up these stories of um, Robin Goodfellow and his clan and his people, and continues in a sort of gives us a kind of medieval um, folk tale or legend, but with a very, I think, contemporary way of telling it that it both has mythic resonance, but also has a very tactile, a very material reality to it. What was you? Were you attempting um, a particular style, or was it just the way that the story demanded to be told?
Um, no, I wasn't attempting a particular style. It just sort of came through like that. I mean, the
Mm,
way that I do my writing is very much a mystical practice where I sort of just let things roll on through, I guess.
yeah,
Um, and yeah, that was how it rolled on through. I originally had intended to write multiple books in the way that I did with the Christopher book, so
yeah,
like of having book one, book two, book three. But our maid and Rebecca said to me one day, "What if it was an enormous epic?"
yeah,
And yeah, shortly before my brain tumor was found, I did this huge sprint to write this thing. In some ways, it's some parts of it seem almost unfamiliar to me. But yeah, that's how it happened.
yeah. And so, do you think you'll return to that world in a
I
future
think
novel?
um sort of. I think that it comes back through the other novels.
Right.
Like all of them turn out to have like this kind of structure where all of the threads are crossing each other, whether past, present, future,
And the,
etc.
and this is the thing as well, where because you have characters and scenarios and sort of avatars of different characters that can move back and forward through time, that can see different eras, there is this possibility that, you know, all of them can join together. Um, and that one I think that the Unless They're Wicked was kind of an early version of it, wasn't it?
Yes, that was back when I was intending to do the book one, book two, book three.
Right.
So there is sort of some stuff in Unless They're Wicked that has been redacted from the Gusty Deep just due to the sheer size of it.
Yeah.
But I consider it to still be part of it. It's just it's not written down anywhere, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I read Unless They're Wicked, and then when the Gusty Deep came out, and I was like, oh great, now I've got the whole thing. And I think that anyone who
Mm,
enjoys um, medieval fantasy or like medieval historical novels, especially stuff that deals with folklore, especially stuff that deals with kind of a more a kind of an askew take on some of the legends of the fairies, of the woodland, the children from the woods, Robin Hood, all of that. This is it's an amazing epic. It is absolutely brilliant, and it's got sort of um, it makes me think a little bit of the description by the grandfather in The Princess Bride. It's got sword fighting, true love, monsters. It's got the whole lot. It's got everything. So it's a real yarn. And I think that anyone who loves those kind of things should absolutely go and seek it out. Um, so that's the Gusty Deep. But then we sort of come historically forward, but in the history of writing backward to the Christopher Penrose novels. And
mm,
these, we were just talking before we hit record, and I was saying that I read these in sequence, and you and I corresponded about them, and I particularly was, exchanging with you about when you were in the revisions to the Heart of Hidden Things, and so I feel when I look back at these novels now, I feel this very kind of affectionate sense of nostalgia of reading the story of a coming of age, of reading the story of a
mm.
young person coming into their adulthood, coming into their magical initiation, coming into their finding their people. Um, and so I feel a great warmth towards these novels. When did you start the Christopher Penrose novels?
Well, the original draft was when I was 21, and I think there's still segments of that original draft in the one now, but it's been significantly reworked since then as my writing style matured. But still, as I say, there are chunks of it in there that go right back into my 20s. And then subsequently, since then, I've been writing the other ones. And uh, yeah, I've written more than four, to be honest with you, but I'm sort of reformulating number five in a lot of ways just because, well, anyway, that loops back around to the whole haunted books thing, and I won't, I won't tackle that too much right now. But
Okay.
yeah, they've gone on since my 20s.
Wow. So it's in a sense when I read them, I can see this process that I absolutely recognize, which is the fictionalization and the mythologization and the symbolizing of one's own life. Do you
Hmm.
feel that they have tracked your own life, not sort of note for note, but that they have been a constant sort of game of mirrors, game of smoke and mirrors with what has been going on in your life?
There's definitely eruptions that have come into my life that seem to reflect things that happen in the books, but expecting it to happen in any kind of narrative order or that it will follow the same trajectory is something that's turned out to be a mistake, which is one of the reasons why I've done a little bit of reworking on some things. I feel like they definitely do interact with my life, but I think at first I thought maybe that you could actually specifically write certain events into being, but I don't
Mm,
think it works like that really. It's more of an interaction. It's more of like a back and forth,
absolutely.
energetic
Because they have to
experience.
they
Yeah.
have to come from somewhere first. Like they come from your life first and your experience and your thought and your development, and then you put them into the book, and then they as you say, they kind of reflect back and you reflect back. Where did the character of Christopher come from? So just to tell us how they start off. Who is Christopher Penrose?
Um, that's kind of a difficult question because he just kind of arose out of the land and out of my psyche at a particular time when I was in England and I was in Wiltshire and all that sort of area around where he's meant to come from. And he just kind of, I don't know, I dreamt him into being. But as time has gone on, I've realized that he is sort of an emanation of the Witchmaster. I think, he is becoming that as he goes along. At first, he's a boy, and then he becomes
Mm,
a man, and then he becomes like a fairly skillful occultist. And eventually, he's becoming, which I think is true for all of us at some level, that we're all becoming something which is in us from the word go, and that's
mm,
kind of our divinity, our inner sort of what we would call a soul god, and the sort of the god that we align with most
mm,
closely. And I think for Christopher, that is definitely the Witchmaster, and for that reason, he aligns with other people in my stories that have also taken that role. And I think as time goes on, which I won't go into too much because those are things I want people to find in my books.
yeah,
But as time goes on, one does see those echoes coming out more in his character of who he's connected to. He's not me, I don't think. I don't think he's me, but then sometimes he is. Like it's as I say, it's not stable like that. It's not like
yeah,
one character is this person. Most of the time he's not me. But yeah, I think as those books progress, like I think if you got up to book 4 in the Heart of Hidden Things, you can see how it all links together.
yeah, yeah, definitely. And I think that one of the one of the best pieces of advice that I was ever given as a young writer was uh, don't make your protagonist a thinly veiled version of yourself, because
Mm,
then you'll be afraid to do things to them. You'll be afraid for bad things to happen to them. You'll be afraid to present them in a light that is less than flattering. And so when I started myself, you know, around the same age actually as you, around 21, writing a novel with a protagonist, I very explicitly thought to myself, okay, obviously I have to write from my own knowledge and experience, but I'm going to take these parts of myself and I'm going to place them almost like I took certain aspects of myself and put them in a petri dish to see what would develop. And you know, like taking you know, cuttings of hair and nails and putting them in a little leather bag, and but it created something which kind of acquired its own reality, acquired its own selfness that seemed outside what I had put into it or decided. It developed on its own. And
mm,
then I was able to kind of basically just listen and see what would happen to this person, open my awareness and say, okay, this this person, this character, what would happen to them? I'm very interested in what you said about when you started out. He's a boy, and he is. I think he's maybe 19 or so at the beginning,
18, yeah.
18, and we see this kind of disaffected teenager, um, who then, over the course of the books, as you say, he undergoes this kind of development and series of initiatory experiences and gains knowledge and gains skill and power and ability in as an occultist in witchcraft. And I'm interested to know that when you started to write, did you know that that's what he would become? Did you already know, or did it just kind of happen?
It just kind of happened. I didn't even think I was going to write more than one book. I thought it would be a standalone book, but then he just kept coming back.
Yeah.
Um, like any disobedient egregore of a creature, he just kept on coming back. And he has gone away at times and then come back again. And each time he comes back more mature in each time he wants a new book written about him. There's a step up in his maturity and in his power. And yeah, it's been quite an enjoyable process to let that come through me.
It is fascinating because it does feel, and when you look at him and when you look at, let's say, the constellation of mentors and colleagues and lovers and so on that are around him, I'm imagining that they too are obviously not corresponding to people in your real life, but there's a sort of a reflection of, or a kind of um there's an echo there's an echo of the same kinds of constellations and relationships that you have had. But it seems like those people in the books, Christopher and uh his group of people, his coven, I guess, um they do seem to claim to have a claim on an independent identity and an independent reality.
They do. I mean, they definitely came first before some of the people that have popped up into my life that seem to echo some of the characters in his coven, for sure, in some quite profound ways that I can't really go into because they involve other people's lives and names and
Of course, of course.
everything. But yeah, in that way, I guess I thought that the books were either predicting or manifesting those results in some way. Now I just think it's just a wonderful sort of symphonic experience of
Yeah,
two realities that are just moving together in some strange way, which is quite wonderful. And I think that as I've relaxed into that, I feel more able to write more of them.
yeah. I see what you mean, and I think that this is where it's different from, for example, something like Aidan Doctor's Black Book practice, where you try to kind of almost journal a future in order to bring it into being. But this is
Mm.
different because fiction doesn't work like that. Like, there isn't that same level of intentionality. You see later, oh, I see the echo, I see the almost like a play on meaning, almost tricksterish, the way that the things that came up in fiction, but that were not, that were inspired. They weren't, it wasn't just volition, it wasn't decision. And then you see in real life, okay, I see that reflection, I see that echo, I see that rhyme. Um, but it's not as set out. You're not setting out to do something. It's something that moves through you. It happens.
I think originally I went through different phases. At first, I wasn't setting out to do anything, I was just writing. Then I realized that it was producing some effects in this world, and I started to actually consciously work with it as a form of story sorcery, which I do think, it had results for sure. But after a while, I became unsure whether it was sorcery or whether it was divination.
Yeah.
Like, had I predicted instead of created those results?
I
And now
sometimes,
I've sort of,
mm, I was going to say, I sometimes wonder, can we even separate those things in a way? The act of
well,
prediction
that
and the
was
act
what I
of
was
bringing
coming
into being, right?
to. Oh, absolutely. And I think that's where I've come to now as a sort of a third place between those two things, which I think maybe partakes of both.
And do you think that, obviously, I can see when you talk, and I think this is the same as anyone who's conscientious, you know, we don't we don't speak of certain things because they refer to other people, they're not ours to say, or they refer to things that are private, secret, etc. But there's an
Mm.
interesting issue that I feel comes up. There are certain things, particularly, let's say, to do with fairy, particularly to do with um, secret knowledge that we seem to hear, oh, you cannot speak of that. You cannot talk about that. You cannot reveal that. And yet, perhaps there is a compulsion or a duty or a possibility to do it through fiction.
I think when it comes to the good folk, that they're much more open to beauty than they are to facts, in the sense that they're far more willing to let something get by them if they find it to be aesthetically pleasing. And I think if you create good art, then you can sometimes get away with inferring things that you might not be able to write about in nonfiction. And I
Mm,
think that goes for music and visual art and everything as well, that things can't be actually said, but they can be sort of hinted at, and that echo of those things in an artistic form. And most of the time, if one is working with a good folk, they have some kind of agreement with them, like a very specific verbal agreement that says what they can and cannot share with other people. And in my case, a doorway is open for this kind of thing, for the sharing of artistry, as long as it's good. I think if I ever failed to make it good, so people might come for me. But but yeah, like it's a doorway at the arts, I think, and I think the arts would suffer greatly if they lost that doorway, because the realm of fairy has often inspired a lot of different artists.
yeah, absolutely. And it makes me think of the Celtic traditions in which so much knowledge was encoded in poetry and encoded in symbol and encoded in song, and that there are things that we not only can but must express, but only slantwise, only through,
Mhm.
as you say, beautiful art. Just to note, I don't know if this will come out in the recording or not, but just as you were speaking about things we cannot say, your voice dropped out and went crackly, and I lost about 7 or 8 seconds. And so I'm pretty sure that whatever you said just there was not allowed.
Okay, well,
But
fair
it,
enough
who
then.
knows? Who knows? But yeah,
We
I
could
mean,
just table that.
I absolutely agree that I think you're right. If it's good, if it's beautiful, if it's clever, if it's poetic, um, not only can we say, but as yeah, the door is open. There is a way through.
Mm. And I think it has something to do with, or at least this is my perception. I've never had this verified for me, but I think what it has to do with is that with art and poetry and everything like that, it requires the person to participate in some way before they're going to get anything out of it. Whereas with
Mm,
nonfiction, you're kind of serving it up on a plate and cutting their food up for them and going
yeah.
like, here you go. Like with a story, people have to do some work. They have to meet you halfway. They have to be willing to enter that world with you and suspend disbelief. And, they've got to work for that knowledge. And I think they have to be ready for it too. I don't
Mm,
think a person learns from fiction if they're not ready for it.
absolutely, absolutely. And I think that sometimes people, artists, writers, musicians, poets, um, sometimes if you read them with that eye, you can see that they have actually stumbled across things that maybe they weren't even aware they were saying.
Mm,
There are things,
totally.
messages, and pieces of knowledge can slip through the cracks of a work of art that the artist may not even know they were
Mm.
touching
I would
upon.
agree. I would say some of the methods that I use for going into the state that I write in involve opening up those channels to such a degree that there may be things in there that other people might think that I didn't even actually realize that I had written.
Mm. And
It's quite
I that idea as well that you said it earlier, that sometimes when you read back on your work, um, you come across things that feel unfamiliar, that you don't have a familiarity and a knowledge and a memory of what it was to write that.
Mm, absolutely. And I think that's what happens when, because I think my life's work involves those three segments, the research part at the beginning of Sounds of Infinity, then the creative part, then the grimoire part.
Yeah,
And if you think about those three things as playing off each other, if you're engaging in the grimoire part, for instance, you're actually potentially meeting some of these spirits that you're then writing with, that you're then researching.
mm,
The whole thing is a kind of little cat's cradle of threads, really. And I think that's the part that makes the artistry of people who practice occult arts different to other people's work, because I don't just imagine those characters. Like, I can conjure them in some
yeah.
cases and actually immerse myself in the energy of that entity. And I think that's probably is why there is so much artistry in the traditional witchcraft community. I think a lot of people use their their big A art to inform their small A art um, on the regular. I think the fact that we believe in these things and actually open doorways to them has a big impact on that work.
I couldn't agree more, and I think that the idea, yes, that it is this kind of imbricated whole, that the the intellectual work of research, the artistic work of creating, and the magical work um, of of crafting, the magical work of, um, as you say, interacting with those subtle presences, subtle beings. It means that you're doing something that is very holistic. It's not just a job. It's not just a craft. It's not just an art. It's not just a belief. Um, but it's what you said earlier. It's that you are engaging with the world in an artistic fashion.
Definitely. And I feel for me that that is an inevitability of my nature. I don't think I can avoid doing that. I think that's how I know that it's my pathway.
Mm,
Like, I have a skill in those three areas, and I really feel like that's, if you've got that, you should share that. It's
yeah.
the point behind it. It's not just to make it easier for people, it's also to talk to the different layers of a person, to talk to their intellect, to talk to their feelings and their empathy, and then to get them to embody that through ritual practice is sort of a kind of form of communication that I don't think we had access to until quite recently in
Mm,
history, being able to talk to all those parts of someone.
yeah. 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 Absolutely. And I think also, um, I feel that that resonates very much with me, what you're saying. And I think also um, it informs just a disposition towards the world, towards experience, because it's not even just about the productive side of things and the active side of things, but also the receptive side of things. Like if you have
Mhm.
those three aspects always in mind, the way that you walk out into the street, the way that you walk into your garden or into the woods, or the way you look up at the night sky, I think you're always doing it because you're always receptive to all of those aspects.
Mhm. And I think that's a very good habit to be in life.
Yeah. And I think that it also, and this comes back to what you were just saying about practicing makes your life better. And also having that orientation towards experience and awareness also just it makes the quality of your life better because you are so conscious.
It certainly makes the quality of your life richer. I would say.
Richer is a better word. Yeah.
I think
It's
so.
not always
I mean,
fun. It's not always fun.
yeah,
Sometimes it's terrible, but it's
yeah,
certainly rich.
that's right. Yeah, and to me, that's perfectly acceptable at this point in my life. I'd prefer to be seeking out a richer life.
Oh yes, I completely agree, and I think that that kind of um, wealth of experience and wealth of um, awareness and wealth of ups and downs and wealth of events and wealth of perceptions. To me, that's what I value now,
Mm,
rather than more easily quantifiable sorts of wealth.
yes, I would agree.
I think that might be a very nice place to leave it. We've just come up to about an hour. Could we just perhaps um, tell anyone who's listening where they can find your work?
Yes, my website is leemorgansbooks.com, which is a pretty easy one to remember. And I've also got Facebook and Instagram page, and of course my Patreon, which is linked to all of those things. If you can find my linked tree, which is both on Facebook and Instagram, that kind of takes you everywhere.
Great.
Um,
And
yeah.
I'll put that in the show notes. And just, to quickly remind people, um, I cannot recommend enough your work. I've read all the stuff you've published. Um, the the witchcraft teaching books, A Deed Without a Name, Standing and Not Falling, and Sounds of Infinity, the Christopher Penrose novels, which, as I said, very happily are about to be reissued and in a revised edition. Um, the first one being Wooing the Echo, followed by The Bones Would Do, Fire in the Skin, and The Heart of Hidden Things. I must say your titles are fantastic. I love your titles. All of
Oh,
them
they're
are
taken
so
from
evocative.
poetry. That's
Yeah,
why they're all
yeah.
they're all poetry quotes.
Well,
Mm.
they all immediately make one kind of interested and intrigued. And then you've got the wonderful sort of medieval epic ballad of the Gusty Deep, and recently published just earlier this year, People of the Outside, which is an incredible dive into the sort of the prehistory of the others of humanity. Um, and there's a really good discussion of that on the podcast Radical Elfame with Chad Andro that you just did recently. So I didn't go too much into that, but that book is incredible. And it is also very of the moment because I don't know if you heard, but scientific reports on the discovery of a new Neanderthal specimen in France have just been released in the Drome. And it turns out that it is of a genetic species that is totally separate from the other ones in Europe and remains separate for, 40,000 years or something. Um, but fascinating stuff. People of the outside dealing with very deep, dark, profound um, issues, including cannibalism and the othering and persecution of populations throughout history that were associated with witchcraft or not, or heresy, or different ethnic groups, etc. It's an incredible book. So, your body of work, this haunted witch house that you have created, is an absolute brooding, crumbling manor on the hill. And
Perfect.
I would absolutely, absolutely enjoin everyone to push open that creaking oaken door. And on your website, they can also find that beyond the house, in the Rose Queen's garden, beyond the hedge, in the greenwood, or in the heart of the forest, at a deep dark pool, there are your sorceress teachings and consultations, which I've done one of your courses, and it really was um, something that changed me and opened me to experiences that I had not suspected I could have. So, Lee, thank you very much for being here. A long awaited conversation. I'm delighted that we could do this.
A pleasure.
And have a good day. And I shall say good night.
Thank you very much.
And now, peace. Charms wound up.